for them, and I really think that if they get information and they can authentify it, they will publish it. They may withhold it for a few days, a few weeks, a few months, so that they get the maximum impact, the best timing to get more publicity. But I really think that they think more in terms of publicity than in terms of direct influence on an election, a process, something.
So sometimes they take the decision to hold a story for the best and maximum time.
Yeah, that's something we also do at LeMonde from time to time. Pretty much any media does it because you always want more readers. That's a fair assumption.
Sorry, what about if someone becomes aware that they have the information and start paying them not to publish?
Not to publish it? I've never heard of a specific story where that would have come up for Wikileaks, but I don't think you can buy them with money. It's not what they're interested in, and especially it's not what Julian Assange is personally interested in. If he had wanted to become rich, he could have done a dozen other things. He was a good hacker. He could have been hired by whatever agency or worked in private sector. It's not his primary motivation. Wikileaks needs money because they need to have servers, they need to have to pay for lawyers, they have a big volunteer network. They do need money to work, but they're not after money in itself. What they're looking for is to make a big splash. Now, I'm not quite sure where Julian Assange stands politically. You can call him an anarchist, and I'm not sure he will disagree with you. It's hard to call him right-wing or left-wing because on many issues he does not have a clear position, but he likes to shake things up.
Can you even go far as to push that as a nihilist? Or?
That's a hard one. I'm not sure he's a nihilist. He believes in things. He believes in transparency for governance, not people. He believes in freedom of expression, it's true. So he believes in things, but I don't know if he believes in a free market, for instance. That's not something he seems very interested in. But he believes in transparency, in a way. Transparency for governments, as he always takes it into precise, because, for instance, Wikileaks is not very transparent itself. It's very hard to know how the organization works, who decides what, they've never even confirmed who handles the Twitter account for Wikileaks. So, but whenever he can publish documents that show the inner workings of a government or of a big, powerful institution, he will do so. I'm pretty sure of it.
So, I want to shift gears a little bit because we're going to open it up to Q&A after this one last bit, and then give everybody an opportunity if there's anything that you want to say before opening to the Q&A. But the upcoming European elections. So we've seen this here for the 2016 election here, but we have a string of elections that are coming up between France, of course, being the French-American Foundation. Of course, we have to talk about the French election, Olin walking away from a different part, the German election, Italian election that's now going to end up happening that was unexpected, right, based on the vote the other day. So different processes that are about to happen. Coming back to Kimberly. What's Russia's interest in Western Europe, and can we expect a similar type of behaviors in the upcoming processes?
Well, following on from what Damien said, I think the Russian intelligence agencies are happy to work with people who don't necessarily fall under their control and who don't necessarily share all of their values, because that was true in Soviet times as well. And so what you want to find is fellow travelers. They're people that are interested in the same immediate tactical outcome that you're interested in. And if, creating an anarchical situation and exposing people falls into what you want to do as the Russian intelligence agency, you're happy to work with them for whoever they are. One of the things that's been really interesting over the last several years is that there's very good evidence that the Russian government has been supporting, and in some cases even funding, some of the extreme right parties, not only in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe. And again, it's very hard to have anything beyond circumstantial evidence for this. But some of the people who are ideologically, who wish to associate with Putin, whether or not they're actually having an influence on Putin, people like Alexander Dugin, for example, who is known for what's called the Eurasianist perspective on the world, that is sort of a combination of ethnicism and geography mixed up together, that says that each ethnic group has a particular geographic space that they belong in, except for Jews who don't belong anywhere. This is really what he said. He has been holding rallies, for example, with far-right parties that have included both Americans and then people from across Europe. And so if it fits the agenda of breaking apart the European Union, breaking apart NATO, creating a lack of European unity against what Putin is doing, Putin is happy to cooperate with whoever he can cooperate with.
So the protocols of elders design are still alive?
Well, in some form or another, yeah.
But so you also mentioned when we were talking earlier too, when you were recently over in Russia too, the view of, where we were talking about end of history, right? But they see it as
yes.
different.
Yeah, I would say
on the
that
opposite side.
among people who are intellectually oriented in Russia, there is a new sense that the liberal world order is over, that Europe lost, that the liberals, in their attempt to make a liberal democratic world order, fell behind, and the reason that they did is that the losers of globalization have risen up against this liberal world order idea. And then when you combine that with Russia's goal and belief in having what is now called a multipolar system, that this is sort of an opportunity for Russia to come to the forefront because the US and Europe have failed in their liberal goals.
And so we were talking in the context of Frank Fukuyama's book in '89 that was saying the end of history when the Soviet Union collapsed, or actually came out maybe one after the end of it. But in that context, so it's funny, right? This rewrite of when history ends, right? It's going to continue and end again, right? So
well, I don't think anybody in Russia ever thinks that history is going to end, right? I mean, they see it as being a dynamic process, and the question is always who is leading in the balance of forces.
Like Jacqueline, right? It's too early to tell the
Too early to
implications
tell.
of the French Revolution, right? So too early implications of the others. But so with that, though, for the upcoming elections, what challenges? So does Europe face the same challenges of electronic voting in some of these countries? So we were talking, right? So let's talk France, Germany, Italy. Will they face those similar challenges or not of concerns that were here in this American election?
So Damien can answer this a little bit probably better than I can as far as France goes, which has. What?
We'll leave France then to Damien.
In general, most of Europe doesn't use electronic voting. There's some interest in certain areas to do internet voting, and which is very concerning. And internet voting is the most insecure type of electronic voting that you can aim for. And it's seen more widely in Switzerland, in Estonia, and people may have heard a great deal about it because Estonia holds all their elections nationally open to everybody online. Although I think
are these all countries where voting is mandatory as opposed to here? Like Belgium, you must vote.
Switzerland is mandatory? Is it?
I'm just
Oh.
asking.
Okay. Well, then I stand corrected. I didn't think Switzerland was. Estonia, I don't believe voting is mandatory because they don't have a 100% turnout. They like to point to the online voting as being a increaser of turnout, although there's been no studies that actually support that assertion, and there's actually been some evidence that it may have the opposite impact. But what's interesting is that Germany is one. There are some countries that have actually moved entirely away from all types of electronic voting. Germany had a Supreme Court decision determining that any type of electronic voting was constitutionally was unconstitutional because there was no record of the voter intent. And there in the Netherlands, there was a move to go to electronic voting a number of years ago. And after some hackers were able to break into the systems, they were able to successfully convince the government to ban electronic voting in the Netherlands entirely. The same happened in Ireland in that they didn't have a hacker. They asked some computer security experts to look at the machines after they had purchased a whole slew of machines and millions of euro worth of electronic equipment, and then it never left the warehouse, and they didn't ever actually vote on it. So Europe is in a much better place as far as electronic voting goes. I think they're not going to be immune to the information wars, of course, and to the other opportunities, but of influencing the election. But as far as their actual election infrastructure, there's very little electronic voting going on in Europe compared to the United States.
So what's the feel in France then, since you just came back over
Yeah,
and in the heat of the election cycle now, right?
That's true. In France, there are a handful of cities that vote electronic voting machines a few years ago. They're still allowed to use them, but it's less than 0.5% of the voters that will have to use an electronic machine to vote. So there is little concern about the security of the general elections or local elections. But the next and easiest target are the primaries, because some of the political parties decided that you could vote online or electronically during the primaries. It was not the case for the Républicain, the right-wing party primary, but they had a long debate about whether or not allow electronic voting. And in the end, they decided that it would only be allowed in a very limited, for a limited category of voters that were abroad and could not make it to a poll station. But other parties have held their primaries online. Les Verts, the Green Party, for instance, the vote was online. You had to receive a confirmation by paper mail to register, but the website was not very secure. As I was saying, with a colleague, we actually found a vulnerability on the website. You could not change the vote, but you could access information about voters that you should not have been allowed to find online. So that's I think if we see problems in the coming years, it will be more about the primaries than about the general elections, because almost all of Europe is still on paper ballots. Because all the elections are only about one thing. In Europe, you don't have propositions on which you have to make a choice. You only have one name to put in the ballot box, so it's easier to organize on paper as well.
So before we open a Q&A, I want to have Kimberly comment on this, and then if anybody else wants to make any other final comments that we missed.
What Damien just said just sort of sparked a thought that I think it's important for us to keep in mind, and that is the role of espionage versus other kinds of activity, and we might want to separate those out in our minds of gathering information versus changing information. And it's more, I think, the former that we have seen up until this point, rather because I'm sort of interested in what Susan was saying too about the access to the voter rolls. My understanding is that there wasn't any apparent attempt to change the voter rolls. Is that correct?
Yeah. As far as we know, there's been no evidence that I've heard of that the information was meant to be changed, but there were 200 voter records which were exfiltrated from the Illinois voter registration database. And one other thing that I will add is that I was told by somebody from an international community that there was a calling card that was left that was in Russian in one of the voter registration databases that was hacked into.
So
for what it's worth.
I think from the foreign intelligence standpoint, an interesting thing to think about, right, again, goes to intentions and other parts. And once code is out in the wild and it's released, it's out there. So patterns of behavior, again, going back to attribution, you said the hardest thing in any of it is ever determining final attribution. And some people do plant false information, like a false calling card, right,
Yep.
potentially to lead it to another actor. You look at the OPM hack, right, it wasn't so the Office of Personnel Management that stole every security clearance for people who've had in the United States, what was the purpose behind that, right? It wasn't, they didn't manipulate the data to change data, right? So there's concerns about, in the cyber world, right, there's disruption or nuisance type attacks. So denial of service, that just is it to delay something, right, and create a problem that, okay, we're waiting too long, right? That's one challenge. You have the challenge of, is it to just exfiltrate to use for some other purpose, right? So what is China, if they were the actor that everybody believes it was behind the OPM tag, if they know everybody who has a security clearance and you have to list everybody you've had as foreign contacts, can they then go to people who have Chinese people who have been in contact with Americans. Is that what their purpose is? Or is it to find blackmail purposes in the future for potential people who will be in positions of authority, right? Different concerns and motives that would be there. But then you get into the area, especially in the financial service sector, which is a big concern, as well as potentially in the election part. Manipulating and changing data is one thing to change it, right? Because in the banking world, if you can change data, there can be a lot of money that's involved. And then the last part of where the scale of concerns are is then ultimately you then convert from the intelligence to an actual operation of destruction capability. So do you even destroy the data, let alone bother even manipulating it and where it would go? And I think it's a really interesting point to bring up to that of, okay, where are we really at? If it's just taking it, what are those mechanisms? But still, there's an interest and there's a reason they took it, which we won't know for a while, whoever that actor was.
Well, it's interesting that they took it because all of this information is actually available legally if you want to buy it. So they didn't need to hack into it to exfiltrate it, but.
Or is that a demonstration effect? Right. I mean, there's again, we don't. You never know what the actors and who they are
and
or what they're trying to do.
It could have been the motivation as well.
Any other parting out? Because the Q&A, I think the time-wise, I'll come and leave everybody the opportunity to make a final comment before the end.
So, just a couple quick observations that I'd like to get your thoughts on, that I think are, if not directly related, I think at least secondarily related. I think one, every time I watch something on RT, I feel like I'm being actively brainwashed, or at least something's, actively anti-American. Two, no one's mentioned Trump. I think this is kind of important. I mean, we're talking about rigging of the election, but the election in America, at least, has already been done. And, I think it's interesting to think about the relationship between Trump and Putin and Trump and Russia and interests there, and what that means going forward. And then I think finally, and you're absolutely right, this is a French-American Foundation event, so I think it's totally appropriate to talk about France and Russia's role in France. And Marine Le Pen, we mentioned it briefly earlier about the far right. Marine Le Pen has actually gotten money from a Russian bank. What does that mean? Is there anything there? What say you?
So I think a few different ways to be able to look at this, right? I think we'll turn Trump and Putin. What's their friendship, right? Are they going to be like speaking of fake news, the fake picture of the two of them riding the horses together with their bare chests? If anybody's seen that
Along
one.
with Berlusconi going bear hunting in Siberia.
Funny one, right? So, Trump and Putin, are they best buds? Did he try to get him elected? Not to.
How do you know that's fake?
Hmm?
How do you know that's fake?
That is true. I don't know. It probably is real.
Here's what we do know about Mr. Trump and Mr. Trump's advisors. We do know that Michael Flynn apparently accepted money from RT. And RT is, without question, just the propaganda arm of the Russian state. Right? There's just nobody questions that that's what that is. Beyond that, we have very little information about any relationship between Mr. Trump and Russia. We do know that he made a great deal of money out of the Miss Universe pageant being held in Moscow, so there was that connection. But we also know that he attempted to make some real estate deals in Moscow that didn't go through. And that is an indication that he probably does not have the protection from the state that otherwise he might have, because if he were somehow in cahoots with Putin, presumably Putin would have allowed him or encouraged the people who he wanted to make the real estate deals with to be able to build a hotel in Moscow, which didn't happen. We do know, however, right, but we do know.
Or maybe that's just trying to throw us off his trail.
Well, and you can get mirrors inside of mirrors, right? Once you start dealing with the KGB, this is what you're doing. But the other thing that we do know, and that Trump's son said publicly a number of years ago, is that their primary clientele for many of their real estate deals in the United States is Russian oligarchs. And anybody who is a Russian oligarch who still has their money and who still is able to travel to Russia has some kind of a relationship with Putin. And so it's very difficult to know exactly what any relationship was. It would be easier if Mr. Trump would release his tax returns, which he has not been willing to do. The kind of people that he's been putting into positions of actual power, the kind of people he's nominating as cabinet secretaries, do not seem to be people who are soft on Russia. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what actually happens. And in terms of a bromance between them, the evidence is that they've never met. It is possible that there could be some new level of cooperation. I think that several of the statements that Putin has made in his public speeches and that people from the foreign ministry and so forth have made in Russia recently have been very hopeful that now we're going to be in a new era of Russian-American relations. I'm not sure that Donald Trump is going to be taken advantage of that easily, because that's what it really involves, right? That somehow Mr. Trump would be so naive as to believe a former KGB officer without doing due diligence on the contracts. And we'll just have to see what happens, but the people that Trump is seeming to appoint to positions that actually will have an impact on policy choices in foreign and security policy do not seem to be dupes. So let's just leave it there.
So you think a reset 2.0 is actually possible then?
You know, resets have been tried with every incoming administration in both Russia and the United States since the end of the Soviet Union. They have temporarily worked, and then something has always set them off. And one thing I do worry about is that when the inevitable frustrations come about, it's very difficult for Americans to negotiate with Russia. On a very small level, doing sort of academic things, I'm involved in negotiations with Russia. There is just a different culture involved of, whether you follow through on what you say you're going to do and on, who you talk to and so forth. It's very culturally difficult to make headway when you're coming from two different cultures. There will be frustrations when Mr. Trump tries to deal with Mr. Putin, and I can just see what happens when he sends out a tweet that's offensive.
So in France then, going back to the other part of the question, so in France then, is Marine Le Pen then, is the evidence that Marine Le Pen and Putin are together as circumstantial as the ones with Donald Trump, or are they more direct?
It depends on what you put under the words together. The situation is very simple in France. The two main contestants, Marine Le Pen and François Fillon, have publicly expressed their admiration for Vladimir Putin's policy on a number of points. They both, regarding Syria, for instance, they both think that Vladimir Putin is the key to solving the issue, and that we have to listen very closely to what Russia says on that matter. The Front National used money from had accounts in Russian banks. There is as well circumstantial evidence, but lots of it, that Russia has been financing smaller, more hardcore extreme right groups over the years. Small sums that are regular, that help them stay alive and keep having a political activity. So, yeah, I think it's fair to say that Russia is very present in the upcoming French election. And one interesting thing about RT in France, it's not very well known. It's not a big name, but they've seriously bumped up their online presence recently. Just before leaving Paris, I saw that they were recruiting new community managers, and they have a very big presence on social networks, and they're doing a very smart job of publishing French content that, how should I put this, that has some strong appeal to people who feel frustrated by the state of politics in France actually at the moment.
Other questions?
I just wanted to come back to the electronic security of the finance world versus the voting world, and there's a lot of transactions are happening in finance, whether it's stock markets or just personal finance every day, and yet it seems, and that seems to be safe, and yet it seems that voting is impossible to do with a computer. So is finance just not safe, or is just why don't we do voting?
Yes, in a word, yes. Finance is not safe. It's been estimated that the banking industry loses billions with a B in dollars every year. We don't know the extent of their losses because they're not required to publish them, but they can take insurance against it, and they can write it off, and they can factor that loss into your credit card fee, so that they end up not having to feel that loss. But there's a number of differences between voting and banking. So one is that there can be that tolerance for a certain amount of fraud that the banking industry can factor into their risk management calculation and decide that we're willing to accept this and go forward. Whereas we don't really have a tolerance for any type of fraud in elections. I mean, any level. We can't say we're going to accept 0.5% or, 0.25% of fraud in every election. Furthermore, there are other challenges to voting that don't exist with banking, in that we vote anonymously, and there's no way to reconcile it. At the end of the month, I get a banking statement, and I can see if there's any money taken out of my account or there's a charge on my credit card that I didn't pay for. But there's no way for me to call my elections officer and say, did you get my ballot, and note who I voted for, or for the election officer to do the same back. And that's why there's this question of the exit poll said this and the pre-election poll said that, and then the votes turned out and they said something else. We can't go back and reconcile that in any way unless you're going to go back and do an audit of the paper ballots, if that's anything you take away from tonight, from my remarks. I hope that comes
I think
through.
over in the banking sector, though, I mean, it's not as flip in a way that I would look at the role of the banking sector. A big part, I think, that you said is that the risk management structure is very different,
Yes.
right? And so for years, right, even before electronic systems, fraud has always been part of the banking system, that they always write off credit card fraud when it used to be in different forms, everything else that was always there. And then the material interest element of reporting requirements they do have, there crosses a material threshold. They are required to do, but because of the volumes that are there, right, what their risk tolerance is so different of this is an important distinction, because coming into the banking sector, when Jamie Dimon said, right, there's a tax, I'm going to spend $250 million to create my own cybersecurity element, and then he got taxed right after he said that and said, well, it's now $500 million. Well, Jamie Dimon has the ability to do that, where a local election authority, right, wouldn't have the means and the resources. And then the collective action problem that the financial sectors faced initially was easily overcome on the information sharing side, because those collective costs and the free riding couldn't be tolerated, and then there was a need to share information. So they've been able to respond to it in a different way because of these motives that, yes, everybody can learn from, and that's part of the reason the president created the executive order for cyber information sharing. But most other sectors don't have those same aligned interests that the financial service sector has had, and why they've sort of led in this space. But there's major risks, which you can see like the SWIFT exchange, which is the system that's based out of Switzerland that the Federal Reserve operates on, which was the $100 million heist out of the Bangladeshi bank, which was meant to be a $1 billion heist, but because they misspelled a couple of things, that the system ended up catching it. And that was actually user behavior problems, because the countries that had it didn't have credential or protection over their credentials themselves. So the person who had admin as their admin password, that you were able to get the credential from a country that didn't. So then it gets into a way sort of supply chain issues and concerns, which also gets to the election voting systems, the supply chain problems that could be there in software and hardware elements that would be, which is in this way another framing of looking at it.
If I can add, when we think of fraud, we think about changing numbers on the server, but the vast majority of fraud, be it in elections or in finance, is informational fraud. It's someone who accesses privileged information that he shouldn't have, and that makes a good bet on Wall Street thanks to this information. That's a competitor stealing information, key information just before a merger, that kind of stuff. Earlier this year, French police arrested a gang of people. They had hired hackers from Romania, and their job was to get inside a specialized press agency that had financial statements in advance so that they could publish it right at the opening of the stock exchange. And the hackers got them the day before, because they were on the server under embargo, and forwarded them to their clients, who then made very profitable operations on the stock market. And it was a small group, but it was several millions of euros that were taken from delisting. Well, it was not a theft, but it was fraud. And I think the vast majority of financial fraud is more into this kind of informational fraud.
And another big element, and this would be an interesting one to see about on election systems, like the banking sector, another big area that is often less discussed, and the same thing you can look at Edward Snowden and others who have followed, it's insider threat. So in the banking sector, a lot of it is insider threat, not merely just what is happening from the inside, but the risk taking that some people may take within trades that they do that could then potentially have catastrophic effects on the sector itself. So a lot of the cyber pieces are also internally looking, not just external actors that are attacking that system, the potential threats from inside in different ways. Other questions? Someone in the back is.
I have a question regarding the county, what was it in North Carolina?
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Speak louder.
Sorry, regarding the county in North Carolina.
Durham County that you
Durham
referenced?
County, was there, what was it, a question of 200 or 300,000 votes that were?
I'm sorry, what?
Did you say the county in North Carolina?
So can you explain what the
Durham
problem
County.
again was in
Okay.
Durham County?
The-
What, if you
yeah.
don't mind restating what the problem in Durham County was?
So when people came in to vote in the morning, the electronic poll books, which are used to check the voters in, to check that they're eligible to vote, they're duly registered, and then what jurisdiction that they're in, so they can give them the proper ballot style, so that they're going to vote in the races that are proper for them, their congressional race and their local municipal election that may be on there, races that may be on there as well. They're on an electronic device, and those electronic devices failed countywide, and voters were unable to be checked in to vote until they had another copy of the poll book that was dispatched from the county office in paper form that could be used instead, because the electronic version was unavailable. And the electronic version also provides the authorization to vote form that the voter signs, again, saying that they're eligible to vote. And because they were unable to access the electronic poll books, they were unable to access the authorization to vote form. So, for example, I was working, I don't know if you've heard of the 800 Our Vote Live hotline, which is election protection, and they take calls from voters who have problems voting, and I was working the call center here in New York that was taking calls from North Carolina, so that's why I know this story so intimately. And we had a call from a poll watcher who said that they got their poll book pretty quickly, but they only had 10 authorization to vote forms as a backup. And so by 7:30 in the morning, they'd run out of all of them, and they were telling people to go away and come back later because you can't vote until we have the form. And they had sent somebody out to make copies. So, and there were a lot of stories like this in different precincts all over the county, and a lot of people were either made to wait online, made to wait until the poll books arrived and the authorization to vote forms arrived, and there were 40,000 ballots that were cast provisionally. Is that your question?
Yeah.
What actually happens? I mean, statistically, how many people didn't vote? Because that's what really happens. People just say, the hell with it, I'm going to work.
That's the $64,000 question. How many people walked away because they weren't able to
Could you
vote?
compare this year to the prior?
Well,
I guess that, sorry, to finish with my question, what is the recourse these people have? Because you said that the Durham County kind of refused to have an FBI investigation, and we don't actually know what part they took in this whole electronic failure. So I mean, I think there's two issues. I think here there's external influence, external like meaning international or like outside Russia. I mean, Russia or another country, but there's also internal influences in our own country, which may be at play, and which I think we should be even more concerned about, especially when you have people making completely unbased accusations or assertions that there were 2 or 3 million people who voted illegally in California. I mean, all of this sets the stage for voter suppression, and this is this could be perhaps interpreted as a form of voter suppression. And what is the recourse? I think what is the recourse that the populace, the public has for this? And then two, and that's one of my questions, but also, why do we actually have it mandatory that people need to register to vote? I mean, not a lot of countries don't do this. France doesn't do this. Why do people need to register to vote? What value add does it bring to the process? And then we can talk about states' rights versus federal rights, because that's a huge debate in the U.S. But ultimately, I mean, especially when you participated in a national election, shouldn't there be standardized rules that people, counties all over must follow? So if it's physical voting, it should be physical voting everywhere. If it should be X amount of time people in standing lines, it should be like that for everyone. I mean, aren't there ways to make it so, to prevent, these kinds of glitches, and to just ensure that people have, that this democratic right to vote is held sacred and it's thoroughly respected everywhere.
Okay, so to the Durham County example specifically, and what recourse people had, the Southern Justice Coalition sued the State Board of Elections on behalf of Democracy North Carolina to extend the polling hours on the day of the election. And actually, initially, the Durham County Board of Elections agreed to extend the polling hours by an hour to 90 minutes in several locations, and then they were overruled by the State Board. And then Southern Justice Coalition sued. And they succeeded in getting them open up to an hour based in several different locations, but not across the board. So that's one potential opportunity for recourse. Why do we have voter registration? That's a little bit outside of the mandate of our organization, but just as a point of information, I'll let you know that North Carolina doesn't have any voter registration, interestingly enough. Most people don't know that, but that state just doesn't have it, and they're perfectly happy with it, and they defend it to the death. And we have a lot of hurdles around voter registration in other states, for whatever it's worth. But Oregon recently passed automatic voter registration, which is when you turn 18, you become automatically registered to vote. Other states are looking at that as well, and that might be a remedy to limit some of those obstacles to voting through voter registration. And I think there is this tension between states' rights and states running elections, because they are tasked with running elections in the Constitution. But what authority does the federal government have? And there is some authority that the courts and the government has decided the federal government has over the running of elections. And a case in point is the Voting Rights Act. There's
which
other.
wasn't respected completely.
Sorry?
But I mean, there were issues with the Voting Rights Act.
Parts of the Voting Rights Act have been gutted, but there's other parts of it that still remain intact. But it recognizes the federal government's authority to be able to place some basic baseline protections for everyone's right to vote. And then I think the question was, how is the vote?
Did it really change anything?
Well, that's a good question, because actually Hillary Clinton outperformed Barack Obama from 2012 in Durham County by 5,000 votes, not counting 40,000 provisional ballots. Now, 40,000 provisional ballots is a very high number when you're talking. It was a